Hello there, my name's Vince, I'm a composer, welcome back to the channel. In this video I'd like to discuss how you can use suspended chords like this, and this, and to a lesser extent this, or this, to create a sense of floating or ambiguity or tension, or just a kind of magical, open kind of feeling in your compositions. So first of all, let me just break down what's going on at the most simple level. If we take our simple triad chord and move the middle note up a note, like this, up a half step in this case, then we get a sort of a three-note chord which sounds neither major or minor. And we can do the same if we move this middle note down, this time a tone, then we get this kind of chord which I'm calling a suspended chord. Essentially what we're doing here is creating various shapes which aren't easy to pin down in terms of major or minor. So let's get straight into some musical examples. So in my work as a composer, there are generally two main types of use cases for this kind of suspended chord. The first broad type is using them to kind of decorate more traditional major or minor chords, either by preceding them and then resolving to a more typical major chord, or using them as a way of kind of spicing it up, going away from the major or minor tonality and then coming back in. And then the second sort of general approach would be just to use these suspended chords as a kind of foundation for the mood that I want to set. And so this will be often the case in a more underscore kind of situation where I want to create an atmosphere, maybe some tension, and I want to leave things deliberately quite open-ended from an emotional standpoint. So by far the most common musical context in which this crops up is called a 4/3 suspension. And it sounds something like this. It's basically you're reaching the end of a musical phrase, so you're in F major, and then you're going to resolve back to F, but instead of resolving to the F, you resolve to a sus chord instead, and then you resolve to the F. So it's kind of a way of almost giving you a little bit of a surprise, or just delaying the end of the sentence by an extra little bit of material. To me, it has quite a sparkly kind of feeling. It sort of definitely generates some sort of anticipation kind of energy there. It's sort of by nature quite unresolved, and then when you do resolve it, then you get that nice sense of just dropping back into the more normal situation. So in the context of Amazing Grace, you know, there's the suspended chord. So here's another example from the world of film music that you'll probably recognize. So this part, we've got this happening, which is essentially the same as this, which is that shape that we were looking at earlier, where we've taken a major chord and just shifted the middle note along, and then we've got that dropping down to a normal chord there. So, da, da. Rather than just going and just ending there, it kind of da, 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 and then it kind of delays it, and it delays it again, and delays it again, and then I think it goes up a key. So that's another example of a 4/3 suspension. So do you remember I said there were two shapes that I wanted to focus on? They were in the context of C major, they were moving the third this way and getting this shape, and they were moving the third this way and getting this shape. Those are the two things I want to focus on in this video. So far, all of the ones we've been discussing have used this shape and then resolving. Let's look at an example where we use this shape instead. Again, in proximity to a more traditional chord, so that this suspended thing is functioning in a decorative way. Let me play that for you again, but this time starting from a root position chord so that you can see what's happening harmonically a little bit easier. So if we start on a B minor chord, and then we've got the third dropping to the C sharp, so we get that suspended. Then we get it going up to the E in the middle, which gives us a suspended but the other direction. So we're kind of avoiding the middle note here. So we start off with the middle note in its expected place, then we drop it down, then we drop it above, and then we resolve back to the B minor. And all of that is just happening in a slightly different inversion, so with the F sharp at the bottom rather than the B at the bottom. So now I'm going to do a little bit of improvisation, just playing with this concept of having a major chord or a minor chord that's kind of stated, and then moving away from it, and then resolving back to it, and kind of that sort of tension between the suspension and the more standard chord. So here we go. I'm going to start in F major, and I'm actually going to just start with the suspension and then drop into the F major. So obviously quite a few different things going on there, but at least hopefully you caught that one at the end. So just using suspensions in a way that sets up that kind of ambiguous feeling, and then it's up to you whether you want to resolve that tension or not, and at what kind of pace to allow that to sort of settle or not settle. So now I'd like to move on to using suspended harmony kind of as your foundation, rather than just something that you go to or that you sort of come from. This is where we just state that flat out suspended harmony is the sound world that we're going to stay in. We're going to allow the whole kind of feel of a section of music, or maybe an entire piece, to just have that kind of open, slightly floaty, slightly mysterious or magical kind of feeling. So let me just improvise again, and I'll just give you a little bit of a flavour of that before we go on to some other musical examples. So I did play a major third at one point, but then soon after I played a minor third, and sort of having suspended chords sustaining like that allows you to kind of mix and match and not be sort of committed to minor or major thirds in the melody that you choose. So you can do some quite unexpected or sort of surprising sounding things in the melody if it's the sort of thing that would fit your project or the piece that you're working on. So yeah, just taking one of those suspended shapes, say this one, and just kind of plonking that down on some sort of sustaining instrument like this. Can just instantly give you something that has a certain atmosphere to it. And of course it depends what instruments you choose or where in the register you know, whether it's very low or very high. So very low might sound like this, kind of a moody, slightly darker feel. If you go kind of quite high, you can have something like this. And these sorts of things sound quite good in parallel, meaning just to take the whole shape and to move it around. You can do things like that. But let's look at a legit piece of film music that uses this technique quite blatantly. So the first example that I want to take is from the Matrix score. There's a cue called Neo on the Edge from the first Matrix film. I'll leave a link in the description to all of the musical examples referenced in this in a single Spotify playlist if you want to check that out. And it does a similar thing. It just plonks down a suspended chord and then it allows that to just kind of stay and generate atmosphere. And then it does eventually resolve into a more traditional chord, but actually it's not... It feels like you could be suspended there forever until the piece is kind of ready to move on. And the suspended chord that it uses is actually this, which is kind of a combination of the two shapes we've been discussing, this and this, but kind of having both directions of the suspension going and all the while avoiding the middle note, which could be minor or major. I think it actually resolves as a minor chord in the end. But it stays in this kind of sound world for a good length of time. And so, I think that's a good example of deliberately allowing that ambiguity to just kind of percolate through the composition. Another example from the world of film music, which uses suspended harmony, is the Stoic theme from Shawshank Redemption, which sounds like this. So you can hear just the main kind of harmony is centered around this sort of thing. So it's neither major or minor, it's not or, but rather so you could think of it as being based around this shape with the addition of a seventh, a dominant seventh. Generally, the dominant seventh works quite well in accompanying this type of harmony, either as a melody note or as part of chord voicings. On the more poppy end of things, or Broadway, we have this kind of thing. That's from the musical Rent, Seasons of Love, which is the main title theme. And it starts with this chord, which is a suspended chord. You could also voice that like this. So instead of a B flat major or a B flat minor, we've got this. So this time, rather than it being one suspended chord that you sort of stay in for a long time, it's a suspended chord that's part of a sequence of other chords, but it's a sort of standalone suspended chord. It's just a chord that has that suspended sound with no context, no resolution, nothing kind of preceding it or coming after it that implies that it's major or minor. It's just left kind of open-ended as part of the sequence. The final piece of music that I wanted to reference as an example of the sound of suspended harmony is Robert Glasper's version of Afro Blue from Black Radio. It uses, again, the suspended sound as the kind of foundational sort of main sound that it keeps coming back to. It never resolves. The resolution is on the suspended. And this is quite typical of a lot of jazz. Another great example would be Maiden Voyage by Herbie Hancock. I often hear them as being quite moody or atmospheric, or kind of almost a bit mystical. So in Afro Blue, it constantly comes back to this chord, and sometimes this chord, but never this chord or this chord. So go check that out. This one is a suspended shape, the same kind of shape that we've been looking at, this kind of two notes here and one note there sort of thing, built off of the tone below the tonic, or the flat 7. So it uses this one sometimes, which is the one we've been looking at, but it also uses this, which just has a slightly different sound to it. It's more of a kind of dominant 7th-ish chord, but it's not quite a dominant 7th because it doesn't have that major third. But it very much functions as a C chord, as a home chord. So kind of ending on that sort of, that kind of sound rather than ending on anything that definitive, you know, keeping it nice and moody. A couple of bonus ideas just to round us off. So one thing that you can do that's kind of a variant of this idea, but a little bit less forthright or a bit less aggressive in terms of the sound, is to take, you know, one of our shapes that we've been talking about, say this one, and then add back in the third, whether it's major or minor. Say let's do major. And we get just a spiced up version of a major chord. Or if we put the minor third back in, we get a kind of spiced up version of a minor chord. So it's pulling it in the direction of being suspended or being kind of like this, a bit more ambiguous, but we've still got the third in there, and depending on how you balance the different notes of the chord in your orchestration, it can be more or less tense or magical or whatever it is that you're trying to create with that sound. If we do the same thing with this shape, add back in the third, we get this quite nice major-y sounding chord with a little bit of suspended tension and flavour in there. Another really simple variant on this shape is to do this instead. So you've got 1 sharp 4 5, the Simpsons motif. You can use that in a sort of suspended, creating a kind of suspended atmosphere, you know. Sounds quite cool. Same idea, and you can use that to resolve to the third, like we were talking about before, if you want to. Just has a slightly different colour to it. And finally, I just want to encourage you to have a play around with these two shapes just as shapes, not to necessarily think of them as merely versions of a C chord, in this case, but just as kind of shapes that if you start to put different bass notes underneath them, you can get some quite interesting sounding chords. Especially I like using fifths in the left hand. Sounds quite good. Or and you can also mess around with moving the shape around. Sounds particularly good if you want to sustain a low note in the lower part of the orchestration and then have a kind of shape that stays the same but moves around on the top. Just has that same kind of suspended feel to it, but just gives you a bit more freedom to move around. And with all of this stuff, I'm not necessarily thinking about what every chord means or how I would kind of define it in terms of, you know, oh, that's a ninth there or an 11th there. I'm just mainly thinking in terms of how does it sound and that shape, and just moving the shape around and just kind of using my ears as my guide. And yeah, if it sounds good, it is good. So to summarize, we've been talking about suspended chords, which are a way of creating a certain amount of ambiguity or tension. The two main types of suspended shapes that we've been looking at are this one and this one, both of which are characterized by having two notes that are a tone apart and then another note either above it or below it that's a fourth away from the nearest next note. But basically any chord that sort of avoids the third of the chord. So it's in C something, we don't know whether it's C major or C minor, and that can be used to create an interesting, sometimes floaty, kind of dramatic effect that may be suitable for the kind of thing you're working on. And we talked about how that shape can be used in conjunction with a more traditional major or minor chord, so it kind of sets up a tension and then resolves, or it stays on the chord initially and then it goes away to this suspended version and then comes back again, something like that. But also how these chords can be just thought of as standalone, sort of open sounding chords. They don't need to go anywhere or come from anywhere. They're just suspended chords in their own right, and they can form the foundation of a whole chunk of music. Just a way of creating a certain kind of atmosphere. So that's it. That's how I tend to think about suspended chords, or one of the ways that I like to think about it in my day-to-day work as a composer. There's obviously a lot of different ways that you can explain similar concepts in music. This is just the way that makes most sense to me. But do let me know any questions in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them. And yeah, in the meantime, just thanks very much for your attention, and see you on the next video.